All right, sorry about that, folks. Chuck, I think you were saying like, um, yeah, I think you were talking about Mel Blanc before it cut us off, and like something about Survivor or whatnot. Yeah, so you could continue your like the background and history with Mel because yeah, a lot of us are still pretty excited and eager to hear it. My listeners would be very much appreciated to hear about, the struggles and whatnot, the behind the scenes, and just the history of Mel. Like,
You
if you would.
got it. Well, so finally, Treg Brown, who I mentioned before, former Just Sound Effects editor, welcomes him with open arms to the Warner Brothers family and says, fellas, all you directors, uh, you have a new talent to work with and put him to use because he's very, very accomplished, can do any kind of voice you need. With that, Mel began to give them what they were asking for, which was all the new original voices. Now, again, I mentioned before that Mel was uh, possibly the worst historian in Hollywood. So he did claim that he sat down with the fellow who actually um, named Bugs Bunny, or sort of accidentally named Bugs Bunny. You know, the story of the name Bugs Bunny is that there was an animator named Hardaway, Bugs Hardaway. And where he got that nickname, I don't know. But anyway, that was his nickname. And he started drawing the character that we now recognize as the sort of final finished Bugs Bunny. Before that, he was called Happy Rabbit, and he had different features. He had an uglier face and so forth. But now he's the Bugs Bunny we all know. And so the model sheet goes around the studio called Bugs's Bunny, Bugs apostrophe S, Bugs's Bunny. That just became by default his name. Now, Mel claimed he was standing right there at the time and said, well, why don't you call him Bugs Bunny? I don't think Mel was there. I don't think he was there in that meeting. I hate to say that, but he wanted to be known as essentially the guy who created literally every character, working jointly with the animators. Now, of course, he did work closely with them. That's no lie. But was he there to name Bugs Bunny? I'll let you decide. But nevertheless, the struggle, there were a lot of guys in Hollywood struggling to be on the radio for pittance. Here's another factoid about being on radio in the day when radio was the big deal. Being on radio, say in the 1930s, 1938, going into the war years of World War II, the 1940s, radio was bigger than television. Radio was limited to only a few channels, big national channels, just like old time TV. There might be three networks for radio, just like there were at one time three networks for TV. And everybody, that's all they could listen to at night. There was no TV. You could go out to a movie or you could stay home and listen to radio. But radio was as big in those days as movies. If you were on radio, you were as big a star as if you were a movie star, which is rather hard to understand today. So here's Mel, and he's running around town. Now he's a yeoman voice actor, allowed by Warner Brothers to be on radio shows, playing other non-Warner Brothers characters. He's doing like 19 shows a week, 19 shows a week, running from one studio to the next to be on the air live from coast to coast. And how much money do you suppose this fabulous fame paid? How about $4 a show? I'm not kidding. The way I found this out, one day we had an old timer in the studio, a guy in his probably mid to late 70s, who had been a giant star on network radio in the 40s. Hal Perry was his name, and he played a character called the Great Gildersleeve. Well, Mel had been on his program as an incidental character, just a walk-on part, and got his $4 to be there. So I said to Mel, what a thrill it is for me as a young guy getting into this business at the top to be working with the old-time great of the golden age of radio. Oh my God, he reacted so unlike I expected. He got angry. He got angry immediately that I had called it the golden age of radio. And he said, golden age, my effing ass. Okay, Mel, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. What was it I said that you're so disturbed by? He said it was no golden age for us performers. Yeah, the big stars, they got thousands of dollars a week. Imagine that in the 1940s, you're making thousands of dollars on a weekly 1-hour radio show. Yes, but the day players, as they're called, those who just walk into the studio, do a cab driver's voice, an incidental voice like that, or you're the mailman in the show or something like that, they got $4. And the same $4 paid for 2 broadcasts. One, and we're dealing with this issue right now, the time delay between where I am in Saddlebrook, New Jersey, and where you are down there in Southern California. We're 3 hours apart. Well, when radio was live on network radio coast to coast, you had to account for that time difference. And the way to do it was do the show twice. Do it once for the East Coast, and again, 3 hours later for the West Coast. So if it was a 7 p.m. show in New York, it meant that you were doing it 3 hours earlier, 7:65, right? 4 o'clock in Los Angeles. And then you would do it at 7 o'clock Los Angeles time for the West Coast. Well, he did 2 shows for $4. 2 shows for $4 total pay. And the union wasn't really started up yet. That's something else that people need to know about cartoons. Mel Blanc was in the group of people who turned cartoon voice work into serious, well-paid business. He absolutely does get credit for that. He was the pioneer who made it a legitimate job. Before then, doing cartoon voices was considered a joke. You were at the lowest end of show business. You're doing silly voices for very little pay. And, you know, as I said, Mel didn't even make big pay during the best days of Warner Brothers. It was left out. Now, over on TV, that was union from the start. For network TV, that was after American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. And therefore, the guys who did TV cartoons always made union pay. And that was a huge difference, hundreds of thousands a year for a guy like Dawes Butler over at Hanna-Barbera, or for Paul Frees working for Disney. And by the way, Paul Frees's voice was used at the Disney parks. He was the voice of the haunted castle, the haunted house, post ghost, as I think they call him. Well, I got to work with him, and he was completely insane. He walked into the studio in character, calling himself the Baron. And he was wearing a top hat, tails, carrying a cane, a polished cane, and was playing the part of the Baron in real life as he walked in the door, off the street, okay? He didn't like being just plain old Paul. He liked being in character in the real world. Strange man, to say the least. Well, we did this session, and Mel and he were tremendously strong rivals. The only person who really was a threat to Mel at all was Paul Frees. And so they were occasionally cast together. Imagine that, these two enemies. And I mean, they were mortal enemies, but for real. And what happens is one of them flubs a line. The other goes after him savagely at that point. What's wrong with you, you moron? You can't read the script. It's right in front of your eyes. And they started riffing insults at each other in characters, bringing out their different. Can you imagine this? These two giants who did between them literally 1,000 voices, and they're using them all as ammunition against each other to top each other. Well, I went to turn the tape recorder off because we weren't making the children's shoe commercial that they were both hired for. But Noel Blanc looked at me and he said, "Are you crazy? Let it roll. Let it roll. This is gold." And so I did. I don't know if he has possession of that tape to this day, but it was amazing to hear these two giants of cartoon work insulting each other in cartoon voices. Is that something? Wow. Now, ask me more questions. Lead me into some other thing, please.
Sure, sure.
Rob? Yeah.
Yeah, I just already, man, like Mel Blanc and Paul Frees just swearing at each other in cartoon voices. That's
Yeah.
oh man, I bet somebody would listen to this and I bet you somebody would just literally give like, I don't know, an arm and a leg just to
Yes.
hear that
Oh,
session.
oh
Oh
yes.
man, that must have been
I
like
wish,
a mind
I wish
gold
it could be,
comedy there.
but here's what happened. We were on tape, and as soon as that tape came off of the recorder, it got put in the vault. It got put under lock and key because what Noel Blanc knew was that these sort of tapes traveled around in Hollywood. And we got some doozy ourselves. We got one with the great Orson Welles, the creator of what many directors considered the greatest motion picture of all time, Citizen Kane. For decades, it was called that. And here he is doing work for a company that makes canned foods over in Finland. And he loses his patience totally with these two directors. And he's saying lines like them captured on tape in the 60s, like, what is it you want in the depths of your ignorance? Whatever it is, I can't give it to you. You're such a pest. This is among the most famous outtakes that there are of a famous actor, a famous artist, a voice artist, going off on somebody. That, and unfortunately, Casey Kasem's rant when he loses patience with his business partner over doing the famous, what's called the Dead Dog dedication, where he comes out of a happy, upbeat record on American Top 40 and goes into a very sad dedication about a dog that has passed away. And he objects to this. He says, why is it that every time I come out of a happy record, I got to do a damn dead dog dedication? Well, unfortunately, Casey was a nice man. He was a very sweet guy. And his reputation for swearing up a storm at people and blowing his top, I don't think he really deserved it. But, you know, the mic was on and the tape got out of the studio. Now, Mel could swear like a sailor. Mel was not timid about swearing. Mel was a little rough. If I could put it gently, Mel was a little rough around the edges. He was not cultured, remember. He was a guy from Oregon who hadn't even completed high school. He swore, oh yeah, and hearing him swear as Bugs Bunny when he would make a mistake on a line, I won't do it here, I won't imitate him here, but oh my God, picture that in your mind. Bugs Bunny swearing and saying four-letter words. It happened. Of course, those tapes never saw the light of day outside of the studio because his son knew that they'd be copied immediately by someone in the studio, and then everybody in Hollywood would have a copy of that tape. So, but Mel was, here's one of the sadder things about working for him. He'd been in this horrible auto accident in 1961 on Dead Man's Curve in Los Angeles, the infamous curve Mulholland Drive, I believe it was, which Jan and Dean sang about in the top 40 song, the rock and roll song Dead Man's Curve. Well, there really was such a corner, a kind of blind corner around a mountaintop. And Mel was laid out on the pavement. They thought he was dead. In fact, a couple of newspapers printed an incorrect story saying the voice of Bugs Bunny has passed away in a terrible traffic accident. Well, he almost did. And it broke literally every bone in his body, except bones in his head. Every other limb was broken. Now, he lays in a hospital bed in a coma for about a month. The doctors say he could come out of the coma. His vitals are okay. He'd be in pain, but he can speak, but he doesn't seem to want to. This is a true story, by the way, verified by his son. So there's some Warner Brothers cartoons playing on the TV set in the hospital room. And the doctor gets an idea. he's going to talk to Mel as if he's Bugs. And so he goes over to him. He grabs a carrot from the commissary there at the hospital and takes it over to Bugs and says, "Hey, Bugs Bunny, are you in there? The children want to know where you are. They're asking for you. I got a carrot for you here, Bug. You want a carrot?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, Doc, yeah." Well, it's my belief that inside of Mel Blanc, the human, was an indestructible character known as Bugs Bunny. He could fall out of an airplane and it wouldn't kill him. You know, he could have an anvil fall on him and it wouldn't hurt him. He could be squashed like an accordion and blow himself back up again by blowing on his thumb. You know, we've seen that gag. In other words, he wouldn't age and he wouldn't get sick and he wouldn't die. Well, none of the characters did they? I mean, if Elmer Fudd pointed a shotgun right at Daffy Duck's bill, all that happened was the bill spun around. Ah, okay, so nobody dies in the cartoons, even though they get mortally wounded and should die in the real world, but they don't. And those characters lived inside of Mel. They were real to him. When asked, which character do I identify with? He'd say, "Oh, I'm Bugs Bunny. I absolutely have his attitude and everything," which meant he thought of himself as a little wise guy. And he did. And he could be very sarcastic. Mel, being in pain from this accident just a few years before, he walked with a cane. And the pain was unrelenting. I mean, I'm sure he was on heavy medication for the pain constantly. I don't know how he slept. And he was not funny around the office. He wasn't in good humor around the office. I had to say this to Noel, and I said, "Was he kind of dour, would you say, as a word?" He said, "Yeah, Dad was, because he hurt. He hurt a lot." And so Mel was soldiering on in his late 60s, having gone through an accident that destroyed his body, shattered one of his legs in 17 places, and it was held together by silver screws, you know, sterling silver screws. So he was in a lot of pain all the time. He didn't tell jokes around the office. He wasn't a laugh maker in real life. Sad. I got the feeling I was working for Bizarro Mel Blanc because I thought he'd be a laugh riot all the time in the office. He'd come in at about 11. He'd go home by 2. Mostly what he did was sign some business papers and sign a lot of autographs. Unfortunately, therefore, his autographs are not terribly valuable because he's just signed so many of them. He would give an autograph to absolutely anybody who asked him for one. It didn't matter. And he talked with anybody who wanted to talk with and answer all their questions. He'd be on his way to eat lunch. And if somebody said, "Hey, you're Mel Blanc, aren't you?" he would take the time to answer every question for the next half hour. So that was Mel, a very gracious man to his many millions of fans. At one time, it was said that his voice was being heard 100 million times around the world every single day, and that there wasn't an hour of the day when Mel Blanc's voice wasn't being heard on something. Probably not true anymore, but for the longest time, I'm sure it was true. So Mel is in the office. If he would pass through the control room where I worked of the studio, he had a standing joke because my name is Chuck. He'd go in Bugs Bunny's voice. He'd say, "Hey, what's up, Chuck?" There, I made a funny up, Chuck. And I thought, yeah, that's funny. But I realized he's being Bugs. Understand, he's being the little wise guy who is not very polite at all. And he'll make a joke if it's a good one at anybody's expense. In fact, he called him worse than a wise guy. He called him much worse, a little stinker or whatever. But he knew that Bugs was an instigator. Bugs wasn't always in the right, but Bugs always ended up on the right side. You know, Bugs always won. And that's kind of what Mel did. Mel has been a survivor. That takes me back to that. In spite of this horrendous accident, in spite of everybody, as they say, nipping at your heels in show business, that was a Jackie Gleason quote. The great Jackie Gleason, a huge TV star in the 50s. once said, everybody in show business is like a dog nipping at your heels. And you got to keep 2 steps ahead of them, or else you lose your feet, and then you can't walk. So, Mel knew this. He knew that there would be competitors coming on strong. And of course, they all showed up. Some 20 people showed up after he died to be hired to do the voices that he did. I counted them. I actually took account of all of them in my book. And there were over 20 needed to duplicate Mel's characters to one degree or another. Some were very good at it. Bob Bergen did what Mel never heard Bob, but Noel did. And I asked him, does Bob Bergen do a great Pig or just okay? He said, well, outside of me doing the voice, yeah, he's the best of all the people who've done Porky. But it turns out that there may have been dozens of people to replace even one character in the era after Mel was gone. So he was a hard act to follow, to say the least. But he did create a problem, like I said earlier, for young up-and-coming cartoon voice people, with Mel being able to do 400 voices differently. How many of you got, kid? Oh, you do one good one? Great. Well, we're not going to represent you because we're going to have one shot at getting you a job. Now, if you could do 5 or 6 great voices, that's 5 or 6 more opportunities for us to get a booking for you. And so that's one of the realities. Mel set the bar so high that agents really don't want to represent you unless you're like the cast of The Simpsons, the Harry Shearers of the world who can do half the characters on the show and do them so differently, like Mel would do, that you don't know it's all Harry Shearer or Billy West or whoever. The one voicer is rare. The fellow who does, let's look at Nancy. Let's look at Nancy Cartwright. She does Bart, right? Maybe a couple other voices, but mainly Bart. Okay, but that's a great voice. So one voicers have a tougher time of making it than I was trying to think of the name of the guy who does Homer Simpson. It doesn't come to my mind right now because he's not actually well known to a lot of people, I guess. But nevertheless, he does just Homer's voice. That's it. Okay, but that's rare. They really want you to be the man of 1,000 voices if you can be that character. And you won't get in the door unless you have an agent representing you. I had one of my students try. He had a great tape and a lot of really strong voices, and he was in Southern California. He went around with a CD of the voice and knocked on doors of animation houses. And they said, when you get an agent, have him call us. Otherwise, no, you're not invited in. So for the wannabe, I would say that they should study with Bob Bergen because he teaches the business of being a cartoon voice actor. He takes on multiple students about 3 times a year, I think. You don't really study privately with him. He'd be too expensive. But he does teach it, and he teaches the business of being a cartoon voice. Because it is a business. As a friend of mine who's an announcer out in Southern California says, it's the business of show. Show business is more business than show, really. It's all about the money. It's about the contracts. It's about the exclusivity and all that. And Mel did not have good representation. He let a personal family friend be his agent at first. Then he turned it over to his lovely wife, Estelle, and she was not the pit bull she needed to be in dealing with people. And so they kind of walked all over Mel, unfortunately, until the later days when his son represented him as his agent. And you had to talk to Noel, and Noel told ABC Television, my father doesn't work for after scale, because ABC was going back on the air with the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner show. And they wanted Mel to record some promos for it. Noel says, how much are you paying? They said, why, scale, of course, they're just promos. He says with a certain amount of anger in his voice, my father doesn't work for scale. He is the one and only Mel Blanc. Well, actually, Mel wasn't making big money from anybody at that moment, but he wasn't going to take a few $100s either. So what they did, they upped the price to 20 grand. 20 grand to do something that should have paid a few hundred. They paid it because Noel stood up for his dad and told him, "You're not going to get this man for your pittance. He's the great one and only Mel Blanc." It takes somebody, playing good cop, bad cop on your behalf to be the one who says, "No, go jump in the lake. You're not getting me for that price." Mel himself never said no. Mel was a pussycat in that respect. If somebody needed him, he felt so flattered that they had a need for him that, what are you offering? You wouldn't believe how little he made on the Flintstones, playing Barney Rubble. And a lot of people don't know that he played Barney. Well, that always surprised people when he revealed that. But he made $800 an episode as Barney Rubble. Better than Warner Brothers money, but $800. Wow, that's a pittance for network, prime time network TV, where today people can make $1 million an episode. We know that from Friends, we know that from Frasier, from Everybody Loves Raymond. $1 million of what? Big Bang Theory. Here's $1 million for one 22-minute episode. Well, Noel Blanc today is very upset that people can make that kind of money when his dad didn't. I mean, he doesn't begrudge them that they're getting millions of dollars to do animation voices, but he does think it's really just so awful that his father never made $1 million in his career, never made $1 million in his entire career. Isn't that sad? So people had lots of misunderstandings about the money that Mel made. They assumed he was being well compensated. He wasn't. He made more money over at Warner, outside of Warner Brothers, I should say, over at Capitol Records, where he did lots of novel records, sometimes in the Warner Brothers characters, which they negotiated. But he did the famous song, I Thought I Saw a Putty Tat, with Tweety and Sylvester. He did that at Capitol Records outside of Warner Brothers. They had nothing to do with what he got paid for that. So he probably made more money from that one record with its two sides than he made in a year with Warner Brothers, believe it or not. His outside jobs also included network TV commercials, where he would provide a character voice, on TV, or infamously, where he and Fred Flintstone are smoking Winston cigarettes and selling them. People have now discovered that on YouTube, that here's these two cartoon characters, Fred and Barney, sitting behind a rock, hiding from the wives, smoking Winstons. Wow, what a different world. What a different world. But cartoons, for Mel Blanc, they didn't pay a lot. Isn't that sad? Well, it took fighters demanding better pay through unions to get SAG to pay better, to get AFTRA to pay better. And finally now they do, of course, but it's still contentious, Mel formed a little company with Warner Brothers called Warner Blanc Communications that tried selling some of his voices for different projects, like talking watches, for instance, with Bugs Bunny saying, "Hey, it's 5 o'clock, Doc," stuff like that. But, Mel Blanc was a fighter. He never gave up. He would perform for anybody, anywhere, even if they weren't paying him really what they should have paid. Too much of a softie in that respect. Not a hard man to get to work for you, Got any other questions there, Rob? Robert? Oh, Robert.
Yep, I I was just listening in, just soaking and absorbing all the information.
I seem to put you into a trance here. I'm sorry.
No. I'm totally fine. It's just oh, by the way, yeah, so like the performers, Simpsons, like Homer, that's Dan
Right.
Castellaneta, I believe. Yeah, and Hank Azaria is the
I
other
can
guy
say
who
his
does
name
like a
right.
lot of the
Nobody's ever heard him say his name, so nobody knows how to say it right.
Oh yeah. I just
Right?
wanted to make sure that
And
I'm actually pronouncing it right.
right. And he just doesn't do a lot of interviews or anything. So
Oh yeah.
while we
Mhm.
know other people quite well, we've never really got to know him, but he's a very famous, in a way, he's a very famous and very wealthy one voicer, but boy, is that rare. I had a female talent in New York City who I knew 30 years ago, 40 years ago, who was doing a lot of stuff for things like Adult Swim, and she was doing them non-union. But because she was a staunch union member of both SAG and AFTRA, she went under an assumed name. She said, "Don't put my real name in the credits, please, because I could get fined or even thrown out of the union if I get the credit." So unfortunately for her, she had to tell just family and friends, "Hey, listen for me in this episode on Adult Swim," but and we're talking shows like Squidbillies and all that, which are not budgeted for huge talent payments at all. It's a training ground. If somebody, if you really want to get a start, like I say, here would be the career path. First of all, live in Southern California for quite some time. Be a permanent resident, not just transient, and just seeing if you can catch on. So be somewhat permanent, ideal if you're born and raised there, really, and you have a home to live in from your parents, so you don't really have to make a lot of money at first. And then, quite frankly, get a good agent, a really powerful agent who specializes in cartoon voice work, and then pay your dues by doing all these low-paying jobs that, are not great, famous cartoons in any sense. So, you pay your dues in that sense that you're not paying union dues. You may be working under the table as a non-union scab, frankly. Oh, and by the way, when Harry Shearer momentarily quit The Simpsons, I had students salivating at the prospect that maybe they could become the next Simpsons cartoon character and take his place. And I pointed out that if they did, having not been there and paid their dues properly through years of low-paying animation jobs, that they would be viewed as the worst scabs of all time by union members. And I can tell you that the cast of The Simpsons wouldn't have spoken to that person. If you came from Philadelphia and you'd been a plumber all your life, but you thought you did some good voices, and you happened to get hired, well, first of all, the question is, will anybody be willing to work with you? Or will they view you as lower the dirt, which they will? Because, Harry Shearer is beloved, and he's so tremendously talented. So the problem would be, no, you're not going to step into that job. You have to be a player. It's like, gee, I think I'd like to join the mafia. Oh, really? Are you Italian? Don't forget about it. We hear that in all the gangster movies. If you're not Italian, you're not going to be a made man. And it's just the reality. If you haven't done a lot of animation cheap and maybe using a pseudonym and all of that, you're not going to get into the big time animation as a welcome member of the community. And it's a tight little community out there. Everybody knows everybody else. And here's the funny thing, they like each other. They really admire each other, except they are competitors and they all kind of like to get the other guy's job. But, it's a fraternity. It's a community of people with this rare ability to make lots of money by doing funny voices. And you treat your fellow performers with great respect because they made it. They paid their dues. They're doing the good work, the important work. And, you got to climb that ladder. It's not just a matter of, oh, I got hired out of the blue all of a sudden and I never did anything before. That is a pipe dream. That's ridiculous. And you shouldn't even want that. It's inappropriate, So that's my advice to wannabe cartoon voice actors. I've taught some cartoon voice work as a teacher, but I've said this will be more applicable in audiobooks where you're every character in the book. Hey, you do a great British accent? Then you can do Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde if you're a male. I did a performance of that. It's in public domain, so anybody can do it. But I put on my best British accent for two different male characters, and I did okay with it. But it's an audiobook. I didn't get rich off of it. And that's the reality with ACX audiobooks, which I also teach people how to do that. It's kind of unusual to make a whole lot of money that way. The real significant money is paid outside of ACX by the more old-fashioned publishers who are not owned by Amazon. And while you can have some fun, I would say, being in audiobooks through Audiobook Creation Exchange, ACX, don't plan on getting rich. Do it for the love of being characters. Do it for the appreciation by an audience, but don't think, woohoo, I just got hired for an audiobook. Now I'm going to see the dollars rolling in. Not through ACX, you're not. And by the way, there's this scam going on that Jeff Bezos is doing. You've seen it online. Somebody holds up a check and says, look at this, Jeff Bezos just sent me another check for $1,000. And I didn't even have to do anything for it. What they're talking about doing, here's the scam, is you hire somebody to write a book for you. Really? To write an audiobook for you. Then ACX has to publish it as a Kindle book before it can be an audiobook. Then you hire a narrator at a very low rate, like $50 per finished hour. You're paying for all this out of your own pocket, by the way. And you hire somebody from Fiverr to create your cover art, which you need to be published on ACX and Audible and Amazon. And now, supposedly, the money is going to roll in. Really? I've been in audiobooks since 2014. I've made $3,000 on exactly one book. And that was a how-to book, how to sell things online, like on eBay and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, you're not going to get rich in ACX audiobooks. You're just not. And this whole business of hire somebody to make the books for you is ludicrous. And of course, after you sit through the pitch, which I did because I wanted to see what they were up to, not because I believed I could get involved in making tons of money that way. I sat through it. And at the end, this guy says, well, you know, if this sounds like a lot of hard work to you, just pay us $4,000 and we'll do all the work for you. Okay, you're just going to be out $4,000. And then they're going to turn around and say, well, your books didn't sell well. Sorry, what a scam. And I'm telling the world, it's a scam. Do not support Jeff Bezos. Do not support his company if you can. He's a lowlife doing stuff like that. And they use his name liberally. This is why I'm mentioning him. They say, you know, Jeff Bezos is a genius and he makes money hand over fist. And now you can have him show you how to make money. Yeah, right. He cares a lot about you. So if I sound a little disgusted by that, well, I am. That's a scam.
Well, I mean, you
there are
totally
a lot of
should. Yeah.